January 14th, 1944, Westward Ho, in Devon. The sea churns gray and cold beneath a pallid winter sky. A figure in a military greatcoat stands on the shingle beach, clipboard in hand, watching the horizon. Behind him, a team of engineers and army officers crouch near what appears to be a vast, circular metal object, larger than a man is tall. It sits on the beach like some abandoned carnival ride, studded with dozens of rockets, bristling with hardware that serves no purpose anyone can quite articulate. He checks his watch. The order is given. Someone lights a fuse. What happens next will become one of the strangest episodes in British military history. A moment of such spectacular failure that it took decades for anyone to admit it had occurred at all. The rockets ignite with a terrifying roar. The enormous wheel lurches forward, spinning wildly, completely uncontrollable, veering not toward the sea where it was intended to travel but sideways across the beach, scattering observers in panic before plunging into the water with a final, pathetic splash and sinking without ceremony. No one present that day understood that they had just witnessed the grand finale of what would become known as the Panjandrum, the most ambitious, elaborate, and monumentally pointless secret weapon ever devised by the British military during the Second World War. It was supposed to change everything. It changed nothing. Yet the mere existence of this strange contraption would eventually force the Germans to undertake costly defensive measures against an invasion threat that Britain never truly possessed the capability to execute. To understand how such an extraordinary venture ever came to exist, one must first grasp the nature of desperation that gripped the British military establishment in 1943. After D-Day, after the vast investment in amphibious assault across the English Channel, the strategic conversation in London had shifted. The invasion of Normandy was proving catastrophically difficult. The beaches were defended with barbed wire, concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions dug into cliff faces. The preliminary bombardment was destroying far fewer enemy positions than planners had hoped. Casualties were mounting. Commanders were searching frantically for any advantage, any device, any innovation that might reduce the slaughter when British and Canadian troops attempted to force their way ashore in the months to come. The War Ministry was open to ideas. Seemingly any ideas, no matter how outlandish. This desperation created a vacuum that certain officers, particularly those with more enthusiasm than military experience, were only too willing to fill. The problem was terrifyingly simple to state. Soldiers advancing up a beach, wading through water, laden with equipment, were phenomenally vulnerable. They had no cover, no supporting armor initially, no immediate firepower. They were essentially ducks in a shooting gallery, forced to advance whilst the enemy rained machine gun fire, mortars, and artillery down upon them from fortified positions. Previous amphibious operations had confirmed this appalling mathematics. The question became, what could possibly deliver enough concentrated firepower to suppress German defensive positions long enough for an assault force to establish itself on the beach and move inland? One answer came from the mind of a man named Stuart Halley, a Royal Engineer officer with a reputation for lateral thinking, but also, as events would prove, a monumental lack of understanding regarding physics, engineering practicality, or the basic laws of nature. Halley's concept was audacious in its simplicity and elaborate in its construction. He theorized that a giant wheel, approximately 3 meters in diameter and weighing roughly 2.7 tons, could be loaded with explosives and propelled by an array of rockets directly into enemy fortifications. The wheel would roll down the beach, over the defensive obstacles, through the barbed wire, crashing through the fortifications themselves, its momentum carrying it until it was positioned directly amongst the enemy positions. There, the explosives would detonate, theoretically destroying everything in the immediate vicinity and creating a breach through which assault troops could pour. It was, in its own peculiar way, a logical extension of existing technology. Rockets worked, wheels rolled, explosives destroyed things. Put them together, and you had a mobile bomb delivery system that would terrify the enemy and save British lives. In theory. The project received official sanction from the Army's Weapons Development Division, though exactly which officials approved it and under what circumstances remains somewhat opaque in the historical record, perhaps deliberately so. Funding was allocated. A team was assembled at the Whitchurch Aircraft Factory near Bristol, where engineers and technicians began the daunting task of actually constructing the thing. The wheel itself was fabricated from specially strengthened steel, with an interior chamber designed to hold explosives. The rockets, dozens of them, were attached to the wheel's circumference. The theory was that as the rockets fired, they would propel the wheel forward, their thrust distributed equally to spin the device and propel it across the ground. In practice, this was rather like attempting to balance a pencil on its point during an earthquake whilst playing the violin. The fundamental engineering problem was never adequately solved. Rockets, by their nature, produce thrust in a very specific direction. When numerous rockets fired from slightly different angles around the circumference of a wheel, the resultant forces did not cooperate nicely. Instead of producing smooth, controllable forward motion, they created opposing vectors of force that essentially created a spinning, uncontrollable projectile. The team at Whitchurch attempted numerous modifications, adjusting rocket angles, changing ignition sequences, altering the weight distribution, experimenting with fuse arrangements. Nothing worked. But the project had acquired its own momentum by this point. Funding had been committed. Military hierarchies had staked their reputations on its eventual success. Reports were filed suggesting that breakthrough was imminent. Testing continued. The early trials were conducted inland, away from prying eyes, at a range near Bristol. Even accounts from participants vary wildly. What is reliably documented is that the Panjandrum, the name derived from the 18th century nonsense poem of the same name, perhaps suggesting that someone at least recognized the comic absurdity of what was being attempted, never once achieved anything resembling the theoretical performance its designers promised. It spun wildly. It moved in unpredictable directions. It toppled over. On at least one occasion it spun so violently that it tore itself to pieces. But the project persisted. There remained the conviction, or perhaps the desperate hope, that it simply required one more modification, one more refinement. By early 1944, the project had consumed considerable resources and involved perhaps 300 personnel at various stages. Plans existed to manufacture several hundred units should trials prove successful. Training procedures were being drafted. Operational doctrine was being developed. Yet the fundamental problem remained unresolved and, in hindsight, was probably unresolvable. Nevertheless, a final, ambitious trial was scheduled for the beach at Westward Ho in January 1944. The location was chosen for its resemblance to the beaches the Panjandrum would theoretically face in France, and because its relative isolation meant that the inevitable failure could be observed with minimal embarrassment. The trial itself became something of a circus. Journalists were invited, though carefully selected ones, to observe the grand demonstration. Military observers from various departments traveled to Devon to witness history being made. The Panjandrum was transported by lorry, carefully positioned on the beach, and prepared for what was presented as its triumphant vindication. When the rockets ignited, those present recalled the moment with varying degrees of horror. The device produced a deafening roar. It was enveloped in smoke. And then, emerging from the cloud of dust, the Panjandrum came spinning sideways down the beach with absolutely no directional control whatsoever, scattering the assembled observers and resulting in at least one journalist nearly being struck. It careened toward the sea at a chaotic angle and sank beneath the waves. Despite this catastrophic failure, indeed because of it, the project was quietly terminated. The surviving documentation was classified and filed away. Participants were encouraged not to discuss their involvement. For decades, the Panjandrum remained a classified project, occasionally whispered about in defense ministry corridors, but largely forgotten. The entire enterprise was struck from official records, removed from historical accounts and relegated to the realm of rumor and speculation. If the Panjandrum had merely been forgotten, it would represent only a cautionary tale about military ambition exceeding engineering capability. But the project had an extraordinary afterlife. British intelligence, aware that the Panjandrum had been developed and recognizing that the Germans would inevitably learn of this mysterious weapon project, made the calculated decision to allow information about it to leak into German intelligence channels. They did not correct the exaggerated reports that naturally accumulated around the project. They did not provide the Germans with detailed accounts of the failed trials. Instead, they allowed a fantastic myth to develop, that the Panjandrum represented a revolutionary British secret weapon, that it was being perfected, that it would be deployed in vast numbers, that it represented a genuinely terrifying threat to German coastal positions. German intelligence, reading these fragmentary reports, did not dismiss them. They were aware that the British were developing secret weapons. They knew about the Mulberry harbors, the specialized landing craft, the tank modifications being undertaken. It was not beyond the realm of possibility that they possessed such a device. German fear of innovative British weapons was well-founded. The bouncing bomb of the Dambusters raid had demonstrated that the British were willing to pursue unconventional solutions to military problems. And so, the Germans took the Panjandrum seriously. German coastal defense planners undertook studies of potential countermeasures. They developed theories about how such a weapon might be deployed and designed defensive positions accordingly. Resources that might have been deployed elsewhere on the Atlantic Wall were instead allocated to counter a threat that did not actually exist. The Panjandrum, entirely useless as a weapon, became extraordinarily useful as a tool of deception. The comparative context is instructive. The Germans themselves were not innocent of pursuing fantastical weapons projects. The V-2 rocket program, while ultimately destructive, represented a genuine technological achievement. The Germans were developing their own specialized anti-tank weapons, their own innovations in defensive positions. But the Panjandrum was different. It was a solution to a problem that did not require such an elaborate solution. Small numbers of trained assault troops with proper supporting firepower were proving sufficient to overcome German beach defenses, as the D-Day landings would soon demonstrate. The Panjandrum was a technological solution seeking a problem that soldiers and equipment had already solved. When the Normandy landings occurred in June 1944, the Panjandrum did not participate. It never participated in any operation against any enemy position in any theater of war. It was never manufactured in quantity. It was never deployed. No enemy soldier ever faced it. It existed as technology and concept, but not as an operational reality. Yet the resources Germany devoted to countering it were real. The defensive positions built with the Panjandrum in mind were real. The anxiety it caused in German strategic planning was genuine. The weapon survived the war in fragmented form. Pieces of the original device were recovered and stored in various military facilities. A portion of it eventually found its way to the Royal Armories, where it was placed in storage, largely forgotten. Some components may still exist in museum archives, unlabeled and unrecognized. For decades after the war, references to the Panjandrum appeared only occasionally in military memoirs and then only in passing, often dismissed as myth or exaggerated memory. It was not until the late 1970s, when Peter Bellamy, a military historian with particular interest in British wartime deception, began researching what actually happened in the obscure records, that the full story began to emerge. The legacy of the Panjandrum is peculiar and multi-layered. As a weapon, it was a complete and utter failure. It never worked. It never functioned as intended. It never achieved anything remotely resembling its design specifications. Yet, as an element of military deception, it was extraordinarily successful. The Germans devoted genuine effort to countering it. Strategic resources were diverted to address it. Fear of it influenced defensive planning. In this sense, the Panjandrum actually did change the strategic landscape. not through its capabilities, but through the fear of its capabilities. The Panjandrum represents a fascinating paradox in military history. It demonstrates that innovation and desperation, when combined without rigorous technical oversight, produce spectacular failure. Yet it also demonstrates that sometimes failure itself can be weaponized. The British military, having created something catastrophically impractical, found a secondary use for it that had genuine strategic value. No soldiers died using the Panjandrum because no soldiers ever used the Panjandrum. Yet it may well have prevented some soldiers from dying by forcing the enemy to prepare defensive measures against something that could never actually threaten them. Today, fragments of the Panjandrum exist in various military museums and archives, though they are often unidentified and uncatalogued. The only partially reconstructed wheel remains at the Royal Armouries in Leeds, rarely displayed, even more rarely recognized by visitors who happen across it. It is a monument to British military imagination, to engineering ambition exceeding practical capability, and to the strange ways in which history sometimes unfolds. The Panjandrum never invaded anything. Hitler never faced it. Yet for a brief, crucial moment in 1944, a war-weary German general staff had to take seriously the possibility that they might.